Are you feeling a little bit fancy? Today I'm sharing how to make a beautiful flange binding, a fun two-color machine-sewn binding that can add extra flair to your quilts. It's easier than you probably think, requires no hand sewing, and looks really special. The narrow accent or flange fabric gives the look of tiny piping with no extra tools and no hand stitching required. You might recognize the quilt I'll be working on in this tutorial as one of the samples from the walking foot machine quilting video. Isn't this colorful finish great? Hi, I'm Beth Ann. I teach practical, beginner-friendly techniques that help you finish your quilting projects beautifully and confidently. Now, before we jump in, a quick word about skill level. If you're comfortable rotary cutting accurate strips, sewing a consistent quarter-inch seam, and handling and pressing fabric strips without distorting or stretching them, wonderful! You are ready for flange binding. But if you're still working on those skills, no worries at all. You might want to start with my introductory machine binding video first, where I break each step down in beginner-friendly detail. I'll link it in the description. A quick note, I'm going to share what works for me, but please remember, this is only one of many ways to do this. I find that each step contributes to a smooth, hassle-free result, so I'm going to share my process. As always, if another method works better for you or you prefer a different look, do that. Let's begin with some design decisions. If your quilt has points, skinny pieces, or detailed piecing close to the edge, you might want to add a border before binding. It gives the quilt a little breathing room and will help preserve those details. Here's Ronan doing his best Vanna White impression to showcase another fun option. If you match your machine binding to the outer border of your quilt, the flange color can visually float along the edge. But borders are definitely not mandatory. I chose not to add any borders to this quilt. You can also decide what width of strips you want to use. For this tutorial, we're going to stick with just two options. Option A finishes just a little wider, but is noticeably easier to sew. You'll cut the main fabric strips 1.5 inches wide and cut the flange or accent fabric 1 3/4 inches wide. And here's option B. It will finish just a little narrower, but it's definitely more fiddly to work with, even though the difference in strip widths is small. For this one, cut the main fabric strips 1 1/4 inches wide and the flange or accent 1.5 inches wide. For either option, cut enough strips to go all the way around the outer edges of the quilt, plus an extra 10 to 12 inches to help with joins, corners, and overlap. Here are my binding strips, all cut and ready to go. Now, it may seem counterintuitive, but the wider strip will end up as the tiny accent or flange, and the skinnier strip is the fabric that will be the main binding in the finished quilt. We'll join the strips by sewing them right sides together with diagonal seams. This will help prevent the seam allowances from forming lumps and bumps in the finished binding. Next, we'll trim the excess fabric on the other side of the seam. Press all of the seam allowances for both sets of strips open. Now all of the accent fabrics and all of the main fabric strips have been joined. Each new strip long enough to go all the way around the quilt, plus extra for joining or overlapping the beginning and end of the binding. Now it's time to sew the long strips together. But we don't want the joins to end up next to or opposite each other. That would create a lot of extra bulk in the binding. So we'll shift the top down from the wider strip. We'll line up the cut edges as perfectly as possible on the right-hand side and sew the two strips right sides together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll press the seam, joining the two long strips of fabrics towards the main binding fabric, which is the narrower strip. And fold the strip in half lengthwise, lining up the long edges carefully as we go. Now, on one side, you'll see the main binding fabric with just a hint of flange fabric, while the other side will be only flange fabric. This may seem counterintuitive, but it's correct. Since I'm planning to finish the end of my binding with the tuck-in method, I'm going to open up the binding and trim the starting end at an angle. A quick check to make sure the angle is going in the right direction. The high side of the angle should be the main fabric and the low side the flange fabric. Then we'll fold over and press a 1/4-inch hem to create a finished edge. Here's a quick reminder. The side of the binding that shows the main binding fabric with just a flash of flange is the high side of the angle, while the other side of the folded binding, which shows only flange fabric, is the low side. Place a pin 6 to 8 inches from the tip of the binding. Starting at the pin, sew down the raw edges of the rest of the entire length of the folded binding with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and a basting stitch, which is longer than your normal stitch. Now you can skip this step, but I find that it helps keep the fabric layers from sliding or stretching unevenly later. The first part of the folded binding should be left open. That's why we did the pin. This will allow us to tuck in the other end of the binding later. Before you start sewing the binding to your actual quilt, lay the binding around the outer edges and note where the diagonal seams joining the binding strips are falling. If necessary, adjust the position of the binding to ensure that no joints fall on any of the corners of the quilt. It's not the end of the world if that happens, but it does make it a lot more challenging to have that extra bulk right at the corner. Now we're going to create a little pocket in which we'll later insert the other end of the binding. If you used a basting stitch in the previous step, go back to your default stitch length, or maybe just a little bit longer than normal if your machine isn't thrilled about stitching through all those layers. Now, working on the back of the quilt instead of on the front, we'll start sewing the binding to the quilt with the main binding fabric against the back of the quilt, but only sewing through the bottom layer of the binding until we get to that pin. I recommend a scant 1/4-inch seam allowance if you're making option B, which is the narrower version. For option A, the slightly wider version, a standard 1/4-inch is fine. We'll stop sewing just before we reach the pin. And once we reach it, we'll stop, cut the threads, and start sewing again through both layers of binding. And you can see the basting stitches on the binding here, as well as where the new stitching will be. Since we're using a 1/4-inch seam allowance, we'll stop sewing with the needle down in the fabric 1/4 inch before we reach the next edge of the quilt. Then we'll rotate the quilt slightly and stitch right through and off the corner of the quilt. This stitching should be at a 45-degree angle from our seam. Here's about what it should look like, although the angle is a little distorted in the photo. You may also notice that I don't cut my threads, I just push them out of the way. Next, to build in the mitered corner, we'll fold the binding strip back on itself at a 90-degree angle away from the quilt. If you've mitered corners on any quilt binding before, this will probably feel very familiar. And then we'll fold the binding strip back over, making sure that the new fold is even with the outer edge of the quilt. Then we'll turn the quilt and slide it back under the presser foot and resume stitching at or just a couple of threads in from the fold at the top of the quilt. And off we go. We'll continue stitching around the quilt, mitering each corner in the same way. We'll stop when we're almost back to where we started. We'll pause and remove enough of the basting stitches to allow us to unfold the remaining binding and cut the end of the binding to another 45-degree angle to eliminate bulk, short enough to fit into the opening left when we started attaching the binding, that little pocket we talked about. Now, there's no need to fold over a seam allowance on this cut edge because the raw edges will be completely concealed when the end is tucked into that pocket that we created at the beginning of the binding. See how nicely that fits in there? Next, we'll adjust all the layers until they lay smooth and even with the edge of the quilt. Then we'll continue stitching until we overlap the previous stitching by about a ½ inch or so, and then backstitch or lock the stitches. This is what the overlapped ends of the binding look like on the other side. Note that one side of the diagonal overlap is slightly higher than the other. This is because the seam allowances are all on one side. This is to be expected. Now, if you're concerned about the seams where the flange meets the main binding fabric not lining up properly, you can always secure them with a dot or two of water-soluble fabric glue before stitching them down. Now it's time to bring the binding around to the front of the quilt, and I'll clean up those stray threads you can see in the photo too. I find it helpful to prime the binding by pressing the binding away from the seam on the back of the quilt with a hot, dry iron. Note that the corners won't lay flat. They're not supposed to, so don't try to force them. Now we're ready to pull the binding around to the front of the quilt, wrapping it tightly, but not so much that the edges of the quilt start to curl. I usually either glue-based or use clips to hold the binding in place. Today, I'll be using clips. Here's a peek at the back of the quilt, and notice how much narrower the binding is on the back than it is on the front. That's exactly the way it should be. Mitering the corners is a lot like wrapping a present. First one side, and then the other. This corner still needs to be finessed just a little bit. I forgot to double check the photo before I moved on. Here's a quick clip with option A, the slightly wider version. This older clip is a little wobbly, so I apologize for that, but I hope you'll be able to see more clearly what I'm doing. I folded down one side. Now I'm folding the other and creasing it with my fingers, putting in a clip. Now I kind of missed the mark with that clip. I'll have to move it in a sec. And I'm putting in another clip just below it. You can see the miter has formed. There, I moved the clip, and there we go. Easy peasy. Now, I forgot to take another photo before I started sewing the binding, so here's a different quilt to illustrate this bit. We'll keep working our way around the quilt, wrapping the binding to the front and clipping as shown here, or glue basting the binding, as I've shown in other videos, in place. It's getting exciting now. Back to our sample quilt, I like to choose a bobbin thread that will blend with my backing fabric. I didn't have a perfect color match, but this one will be close enough since it's similar in value. I'm matching the color of my top thread to my flange fabric. This one, it's more important that it matches well because you really want it to blend in. Now we'll stitch in the ditch or groove between the flange and the main binding fabric all the way around the quilt, removing any clips as we go. I'm using a pin to help keep the seam where the binding overlaps even. One side of the yellow flange will be slightly higher than the other, but that's okay. And here's the finished binding. Notice how the stitching on the back runs parallel to the binding, not on top of it. And here it is, a crisp, colorful flange binding that frames the quilt beautifully. It's one of my favorite ways to finish a project like this. Please let me know in the comments what your favorite binding technique is. For more binding tips and ideas, please check out my playlist and channel members. A link to your printable step-by-step guide for flange bindings will be waiting in the Quilting Friends membership section. Happy quilting!